"I don't think this neighborhood is really what you're looking for," the woman said, and she did not lower her voice when she said it. "Let me show you something more in your price range." She was standing in the foyer of a house on Clearwater Drive, a 4-bedroom colonial with original hardwood floors and a freshly painted porch, and the couple she was addressing had said nothing to suggest a price range. They had not mentioned a budget. They had not asked about the neighborhood. They had simply arrived at the scheduled showing on time, dressed well, and stood quietly in the entryway while the agent, her name was Dana Mercer, and she had worked the Whitfield Realty office for 11 years, looked them over once and made a decision. The couple was Marcus and Renee Caldwell. They were standing close together, the way people stand when they know something is about to happen and they have decided not to flinch. Marcus had his hands visible at his sides. Renee had her chin level. Neither of them spoke. Dana Mercer kept moving. She walked them not to the living room with the bay windows, not to the kitchen with the quartz countertops, not to the primary suite that had been staged with fresh linens and a vase of white flowers. She walked them to the garage that still smelled of motor oil and old cardboard. She opened the door, gestured vaguely at the concrete floor, and said, "This is a good, functional space, very practical." There were 2 other agents in the building. A junior associate named Priya Suresh was near the staircase, clipboard in hand, and she watched the whole thing without moving. A showing coordinator named Dale Whitmore stood near the front window. He watched too. Nobody said a word. And here is what Dana Mercer did not know. Standing in that garage with her practiced smile and her quiet certainty about who belonged where. She had no idea who Marcus Caldwell was. She did not know what he owned. She did not know what his name meant in that zip code, in that city, in that industry. She did not know that the man she was steering toward a concrete floor had signed more real estate transactions in the last 5 years than she had managed in her entire career. When the truth came out, it did not just embarrass her, it ended things. Stay with this one to the end. Every detail is here for a reason. But before we get there, let me take you back to the beginning. Let me show you who Marcus Caldwell really was, and how a man like that ends up standing quietly in a garage while someone mistakes his patience for weakness. Marcus Caldwell grew up in a 2-bedroom house on Fenwick Street in East Columbus, Ohio, the kind of block where the sidewalks cracked in summer and the furnace coughed through January. His father, Raymond Caldwell, worked 31 years at a sheet metal plant and never once called in sick. His mother, Gloria, cleaned offices downtown 3 nights a week and taught Sunday school on the weekends. They were not wealthy. They were not connected. What they were was disciplined, and they raised Marcus to understand that discipline was the only inheritance that could not be taken from you. His grandmother, Estelle, was the one who gave him the words he carried. She was 81 years old and had survived things she never talked about directly, only in the way her hands moved when she was remembering. Slow, deliberate, pressing down on the kitchen table as if to steady herself against the weight of it. She told Marcus, when he was 14 and furious about something at school, "Stay low, build high, let the work speak when you are gone from the room." He had written it on the inside cover of his first business notebook. He had not needed to write it again. It had become the structure of everything he did. Marcus did not go to a prestigious university. He went to Columbus State, worked nights at a shipping warehouse, graduated with an associate's degree in business administration, and immediately started reading everything he could find about real estate investment. Not the motivational kind of reading, the granular kind. Zoning codes, title law, cap, rate calculations, the specific mechanics of how value was created and held and transferred. He had no mentor and no network. He had a library card and a legal pad and the habit of waking up at 5 in the morning to study before his shift. He moved in silence. He built in silence. By the time he was 32, Marcus owned 6 residential properties in Columbus, all of them purchased below market and renovated through a combination of hired labor and his own hands on weekends. By 38, he had expanded into commercial holdings, a small strip mall in Gahanna, a mixed-use building near the Short North, a warehouse in Whitehall that he converted into artist studios and leased at rates that kept working artists in the city. He never announced any of it. He did not have a social media presence. He did not attend galas. He showed up to city council meetings when zoning decisions affected his properties, sat in the back row, and left without speaking to the press. His name appeared in deed records. It did not appear anywhere else. Now, here is what most people in the Whitfield Realty office did not know about Marcus Caldwell. By the spring of that year, when he and Renee walked into the showing on Clearwater Drive, Marcus had quietly acquired a controlling interest in a portfolio of 14 residential and commercial properties across the Westfield Heights corridor, the same corridor where Whitfield Realty had been aggressively expanding its listings for the past 18 months. He had not announced the acquisitions. He had not issued a press release. He had simply done what he always did, moved low, built high, and let the documents speak for themselves when the time came. The time had not yet come, but it was coming. Dana Mercer had been at Whitfield Realty for 11 years, and in those 11 years she had developed a precise internal map of who belonged where. She did not think of it as bias. She thought of it as market knowledge. She had a gift, she believed, for reading clients, for knowing within the first 90 seconds of a showing what a person could afford and what they were really after. She prided herself on efficiency. She did not like to waste time. She drove a white Audi Q7. She wore a different blazer every day of the week and had a framed photo on her desk of herself shaking hands with the mayor at a charity gala. Her listings were the most prominent in the office: the Colonials in Whitfield Heights, the renovated Victorians on Pemberton, the new construction on the riverside of town. She had won the office's top producer award 4 years running, and she kept the plaques in a row on the wall behind her desk where clients could see them from the moment they sat down. She had a way of speaking to certain clients: a softening of the voice, a slight increase in pace, a pivot away from the primary listings toward the secondary inventory, that she had refined over years. She was not aware that she did it. Or perhaps she was aware and had decided it did not matter. Either way, the pattern was there, consistent and observable, and Priya Suresh had noticed it within her first 3 months at the firm. Priya had said nothing. She needed the job. The showing on Clearwater Drive had been booked through the firm's online portal 2 weeks earlier. Marcus and Renee had submitted a pre-qualification letter from their bank, not a pre-approval, a full pre-qualification, the kind that required documented assets and income verification, along with a brief note that they were cash capable if the right property came available. The note had been attached to their file. Dana Mercer had not read the file before the showing. She had glanced at the names, looked at the appointment time, and moved on. That was the first mistake. She made the second one in the garage. After the garage, Dana walked them briefly through the laundry room and then, with the brisk efficiency of someone wrapping up a meeting that had already run long, she said she had another appointment and suggested they take a look at some listings in the Harmon Park area, which she described as up and coming and a great value for first-time buyers. Marcus and Renee were not first-time buyers. Renee had owned her own home since she was 27. Marcus had owned more property than Dana Mercer would ever list in her career. He said nothing. She handed them a printout. Not the Clearwater Drive listing, but a different sheet. 3 properties in Harmon Park, 2 of them priced at least 40% below the Clearwater Drive home. And she smiled in the way that people smile when they believe they have been helpful. Priya Suresh watched from the staircase. She saw Marcus look at the printout. She saw his jaw tighten just slightly, and then release. She saw him fold the paper once cleanly and place it in the inside pocket of his jacket. She saw Renee reach for his hand briefly and then let go. Priya had been at Whitfield Realty for 14 months. She had watched Dana do this before, not identically, but in the same direction with the same logic underneath it. She had told herself each time that it was not her place, that she was junior, that she needed the commission splits and the training and the reference that came with staying quiet. But standing on that staircase, watching Marcus Caldwell fold that paper, something shifted. She did not move immediately. She waited until Dana had walked out the front door. Then she walked down the stairs, crossed the foyer, and said quietly, "Mr. Caldwell, I'm sorry about that. The primary suite is upstairs if you'd like to see it. The kitchen, too. You came for a full showing, and you should have one." Marcus looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once. She showed them the house. The whole house, the bay windows, the quartz countertops, the primary suite with the white flowers still in the vase. She answered every question they asked, and she did not lower her voice, and she did not hand them any alternative printouts. When they left, Marcus thanked her by name. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. And it was about to get much worse for Dana Mercer than she knew. Now, here's what most people in that office did not know was already in motion. 3 days before the Clearwater Drive showing, Marcus Caldwell had been in a meeting with Gerald Whitfield, the founder of Whitfield Realty, a man in his late 60s who had built the firm from a single office in 1989 and who had spent the last 2 years looking quietly for a strategic partner to help expand the firm's commercial division. Gerald Whitfield was the kind of man who did his homework. He had been introduced to Marcus through a mutual contact at the Columbus Urban Development Board, had spent 4 weeks reviewing Marcus's portfolio, and had come away from that review with a single, clear conclusion. Marcus Caldwell was the most disciplined real estate investor he had encountered in 40 years of business. The meeting, 3 days earlier, had been the second of what Gerald hoped would be many. They had discussed a partnership structure. They had discussed the Westfield Heights corridor specifically. Gerald had mentioned in passing that he wanted to see how his agents handled a certain kind of client before he moved forward, that he had concerns about some patterns he had observed in the firm's showing data, concerns he had not yet addressed internally but intended to. Marcus had listened. He had not mentioned that he had a showing scheduled at one of Gerald Whitfield's listings in 3 days. He had simply said he would be in touch. He had been in touch, in a way. Gerald Whitfield received the call from Marcus on the evening of the Clearwater Drive showing. Marcus did not describe what had happened with anger. He did not frame it as a complaint. He described it the way he described everything, factually, specifically, with the kind of detail that made it impossible to dismiss. He mentioned the garage. He mentioned the Harmon Park printout. He mentioned the phrase first-time buyers. He mentioned that Priya Suresh had corrected the situation at some professional risk to herself. Gerald Whitfield listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted several seconds. Then Gerald said, "I'll handle it." He did not say it with anger. He said it with the weight of a man who had been waiting for a reason to do something he should have done a long time ago. Dana Mercer received a call the following morning asking her to come into Gerald Whitfield's office before her first showing. She arrived at 8:15 in her Tuesday blazer, carrying her coffee, and she walked into the office with the ease of someone who had never once been called in for anything other than praise. Gerald Whitfield was already seated. He did not stand when she entered. He had a printed document on the desk in front of him, which he did not immediately reference. He asked her to describe the Clearwater Drive showing from the previous day. She did so, briefly, in the way people describe things they do not think require much description. He let her finish. Then he slid the document across the desk. It was Marcus Caldwell's portfolio summary. 14 properties, the Westfield Heights Corridor Holdings, the pre-qualification letter with the documented asset figures, and a one-page letter from Marcus's attorney outlining the terms of the proposed partnership with Whitfield Realty. At the bottom of the letter, in the signature block, was Marcus's full name and his professional designation, Marcus A. Caldwell, Principal, Caldwell Property Holdings, LLC. Dana Mercer read the first page. Then she stopped reading. Gerald Whitfield said, "He was your client yesterday. He is my prospective partner today. And what you did in that house, walking him to the garage, handing him Harmon Park listings, calling him a first-time buyer, that is the last showing you will conduct under this firm's license." He was not shouting. His voice was level and deliberate, the way a door sounds when it closes on a room you will not be allowed back into. Dana Mercer set the document down. She opened her mouth once. She closed it. She left the office 14 minutes later with a termination letter and a box that a junior coordinator had already packed from her desk. The plaques were not in the box. Gerald had left them on the wall as a reminder to himself of how long he had waited to do this. Priya Suresh was called into Gerald's office that same afternoon. She sat down expecting a reprimand. What she received instead was an offer. A promotion to senior associate, a new commission structure, and Gerald's direct assurance that what she had done on that staircase was exactly the kind of judgment the firm needed more of. She did not cry, but her hands, folded in her lap, pressed together once, hard, the way hands do when something you have been carrying finally sets itself down. The news of Dana Mercer's termination did not travel quietly. It moved the way certain things move through a professional community. Not announced, but understood, passed in the spaces between meetings and the margins of group texts, arriving in people's inboxes as a rumor and departing as a fact. By the end of that week, 3 other agents in the Columbus real estate market had heard some version of it. By the end of the following week, the version they had heard was close enough to the truth to sting. But the story of Marcus and Renee Caldwell did not end in Gerald Whitfield's office. It did not end with a termination letter or a box carried to a parking lot or a row of plaques left on a wall as a private reckoning. Those things mattered. They were real, and they were earned. But they were only the first ring of a larger consequence, the kind that takes time to fully arrive, the kind that is built not from anger, but from the quiet accumulation of what is true. And the truth, as Marcus Caldwell had always known, was patient. Now, here is what most people did not know about Denise Okafor. She had grown up in Akron, the youngest of 4 children in a family where her father drove a city bus for 22 years, and her mother kept the books for a small church on the east side of town. They were not wealthy. They were not connected. What they were was precise. Her mother especially, a woman named Adeyeze who kept 3 different ledgers by hand and could identify a discrepancy in a column of numbers the way other people identified a wrong note in a song. Adeyeze had told Denise when she was 12 years old and frustrated with a math problem that would not resolve, "The numbers do not lie. They only wait for you to listen." Denise had listened ever since. She had gone to Ohio State on a partial scholarship, worked the rest of her tuition through a combination of campus jobs and summer work at a title company in downtown Akron, and graduated with a degree in accounting that she had earned with the kind of focus that left little room for anything else. She passed the CPA exam on her first attempt. She joined a mid-sized firm in Columbus, spent 5 years learning the architecture of institutional finance, and then left to build something of her own. She moved in silence. She built in silence. By the time she was 40, Denise Okafor was a licensed CPA, a certified forensic accountant, and the founder of Okafor Financial Group, a boutique firm specializing in real estate transaction audits, portfolio valuations, and what she called, in the plain language she preferred, finding what people try not to find. Her client list was not public. Her office was not large, but the work she did was the kind that ended careers and opened investigations, and the people who knew her name knew it with a particular quality of respect, the kind reserved for someone who could walk into a room full of numbers and come out holding the one that changed everything. She had a habit of arriving early, leaving late, and saying very little in between. She kept a small framed card on her desk, her mother's handwriting, the ink faded to the color of old tea. "The numbers do not lie," it read. "They only wait for you to listen." She had not needed to frame it twice. Now, here's what most people did not know about Hargrove Capital Partners. They were a private equity firm with offices in a glass tower on the east side of Columbus, and they had been operating in the Ohio commercial real estate market for 7 years under the leadership of a man named Clifton Hargrove. Clifton Hargrove was 54 years old, silver-haired and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from having been right in public enough times that being wrong in private no longer registers as a category of possibility. He had grown up wealthy, gone to school wealthy, and had spent his adult life in the specific ecosystem of people who had done the same. A world where access was assumed, where the right handshake opened the right door, and where the size of a man's office was considered a reasonable proxy for the size of his judgment. Hargrove Capital had made its name in commercial acquisitions, purchasing undervalued properties, restructuring them, and reselling them at multiples that impressed their investors and irritated their competitors. Clifton Hargrove was good at this. He was also, as anyone who had worked closely with him could tell you in a lowered voice, very good at finding the legal edge of a transaction and standing as close to it as possible without stepping over. He drove a black Mercedes S-Class. He kept a membership at the Ashford Club where he lunched on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and where he had been known to conduct business in the dining room in a voice that carried to adjacent tables. He had a framed photograph on the wall of his office, himself shaking hands with a state senator at a fundraiser, and he referenced it, obliquely, more often than the situation required. His firm had never been formally investigated. It had been informally examined twice, both times by auditors who had found the paperwork in order and moved on. The paperwork had been in order because someone had made sure of it. That someone was not Clifton Hargrove. He did not think of himself as a man who cut corners. He thought of himself as a man who understood how corners worked. And he had never once in 7 years of operating in Columbus encountered anyone who understood them better than he did. That was about to change. The transaction that brought Denise Okafor into contact with Clifton Hargrove began, on the surface, as a routine portfolio valuation. A pension fund with holdings in 3 of Hargrove Capital's commercial properties had requested an independent audit as part of a routine compliance review. The request was standard. The timeline was standard. The firm assigned to conduct the audit was Okafor Financial Group, selected from a list of certified forensic accounting practices by the pension fund's board. Clifton Hargrove was informed of the selection on a Monday morning. His assistant, a young man named Trevor Park, brought the notification to his desk along with his coffee and his calendar. Hargrove read the firm name, did not recognize it, and set the notification aside. He told Trevor to send the standard cooperation documents and schedule the preliminary meeting for the following week. He did not look up Okafor Financial Group. He did not ask about its principal. He glanced at the name once, made a judgment in the space between one breath and the next, and moved on to the rest of his morning. That was the first mistake. Denise Okafor arrived at the Hargrove Capital offices on a Thursday at 9 in the morning. She was dressed in a charcoal blazer and dark trousers, and she carried a leather portfolio that had been a gift from her mother on the day she passed the CPA exam. She had with her a single associate, a young man named Kwame Asante, who had been with her firm for 2 years and who had a gift for pattern recognition that Denise had identified in his first month and cultivated carefully since. The receptionist asked her to wait. She waited for 14 minutes. She did not check her phone. She sat with her portfolio on her lap and her hands resting on top of it, and she looked at the lobby the way her mother had taught her to look at a column of numbers, not for what was there, but for what was missing. Clifton Hargrove came to the lobby himself, which she had not expected. He was taller than she had anticipated, and he moved with the ease of someone who had never once entered a room and wondered whether he belonged in it. He extended his hand and said, "Ms. Okafor, we appreciate you coming in." His tone was pleasant. His eyes moved past her to Kwame briefly and then back. "Thank you for accommodating us," she said. He led them to a conference room on the 14th floor, where 3 members of his finance team were already seated. The table was long and glass-topped, and the view behind it showed the city in the flat gray light of a November morning. Hargrove sat at the head of the table. He gestured for Denise to sit at the side. Kwame took the chair beside her. The finance team presented their preliminary documents. Denise listened. She asked 3 questions, each of them precise, each of them answered with the smooth efficiency of people who had prepared for a general audit and not for the specific kind that Denise Okafor conducted. She wrote nothing down during the presentation. She had Kwame's notes. She did not need her own. When the presentation concluded, Hargrove leaned back in his chair and said, "I think you'll find everything is in order. We run a clean operation here." He said it with the particular warmth of a man delivering a verdict rather than an invitation. Denise looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "We'll need access to the subsidiary transaction records, the full chain, going back to the initial acquisition dates." There was a pause. One of the finance team members, a woman named Sandra Leith, who had been with Hargrove Capital for 4 years and who had a quality of stillness about her that Denise had noticed when she walked in, shifted slightly in her chair. Hargrove said, "That's a broader scope than the standard review." "It is," Denise said. "It's what the pension fund has requested." He looked at her for another moment. Then he smiled, the way people smile when they are recalibrating without wanting to show it, and said, "Of course, we'll get you what you need." He said it easily. He said it like a man who believed that what she needed and what she would find were two entirely different things. He was wrong. What Denise Okafor found over the following 3 weeks of document review was not hidden in the way that hidden things are usually hidden, buried in code or obscured by complexity. It was hidden the way certain things are hidden in plain sight, in the gap between what a document said and what the underlying transaction actually was, in the difference between a recorded sale price and the actual consideration exchanged, in the pattern of related party transactions that appeared in the subsidiary records and did not appear anywhere in the summary financials that Hargrove Capital had been providing to its investors. It was not one thing. It was a structure, layered, deliberate, and constructed over years. Sandra Leith was the one who opened the door. She came to Denise's temporary office, a small room on the 12th floor that Hargrove Capital had provided for the duration of the audit, on a Wednesday evening when the rest of the floor had emptied. She knocked twice, sully, and waited in the doorway. She was carrying a manila folder, and she held it the way people hold things they have decided to let go of after a long time of holding on. She had been at Hargrove Capital for 4 years. She had seen the structure being built. She had said nothing because she needed the job, because she had 2 children and a mortgage and a mother in assisted living, and because she had told herself each time that it was not her place, that she was junior, that the people above her must have understood something she did not. She had told herself those things for 4 years, and on that Wednesday evening, standing in a doorway with a folder in her hands, she stopped telling herself any of them. She set the folder on Denise's desk. She said, "This is what you're looking for." Then she said, "I know what this means for me." Denise looked at the folder. Then she looked at Sandra Leith. "What it means for you," she said, "depends on what you do next. And what you just did, that matters." Sandra Leith nodded once. She sat down in the chair across from Denise's desk, and for the next 2 hours she answered every question Denise asked. The folder contained internal memoranda, routing instructions, and a series of transaction summaries that documented, in the plain language of numbers, a pattern of investor misrepresentation spanning 6 years and more than $40 million in commercial real estate transactions across 3 Ohio counties. It was not speculation. It was not inference. It was the architecture of a fraud laid out in the handwriting of people who had believed they were the only ones who knew how to read it. Denise Okafor knew how to read it. She had learned from her mother. The numbers did not lie. They only waited for someone to listen. She spent 3 more days completing the documentation. She did not call Clifton Hargrove. She did not send a preliminary notice. She submitted her findings to the Pension Funds Board, to the Ohio Division of Securities, and to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission on the same morning, through the proper channels, in the proper order, with the kind of precision that left no procedural gap for anyone to exploit. Clifton Hargrove received the first call from his attorney at 7:45 that morning. He was in his car on his way to the Ashford Club for his Tuesday lunch. He did not make it to the club. He pulled over on a side street 3 blocks from his office and sat there with the engine running, holding his phone, while his attorney explained what had been filed and by whom. He had not looked up Okafor Financial Group. He had not asked about its principal. He had glanced at a name once and made a judgment. He would not make that mistake again. He would not have the opportunity. The investigation that followed was conducted by the Ohio Division of Securities in coordination with federal regulators, and it moved with the particular momentum of a case built on documentation rather than testimony. Steady, procedural, and impossible to redirect once it had begun. Hargrove Capital's offices were served with a preservation order within 72 hours of the initial filing. 3 of Clifton Hargrove's senior partners retained separate counsel within the week. The firm's investor communications were suspended pending review. Clifton Hargrove resigned from the firm he had built 11 days after Denise Okafor submitted her report. He did not issue a statement. His attorney issued a statement on his behalf, and it said nothing that the documents had not already said more clearly. Sandra Leith cooperated fully with investigators. She was granted whistleblower protections under federal statute. She did not lose her professional license. She lost the job, which she had already known she would lose, and she found another one, a better one, with a firm that had heard, through the channels that such things travel, that she was the kind of person who, when it mattered, told the truth. Denise Okafor returned to her office on a Friday afternoon, set her leather portfolio on her desk, and sat down in her chair. She looked at the framed card in her mother's handwriting for a long moment. Then she opened her calendar and moved on to the next thing. She did not celebrate. She did not need to. The work had spoken for itself. Restraint, she had always understood, was not the absence of power. It was the decision about when to use it, and how, and in service of what. Her mother had taught her that too. The reckoning, when it came for Clifton Hargrove, did not arrive the way he had always imagined his enemies would come for him, loudly, frontally, with the kind of confrontation that a man of his particular confidence could meet and redirect. It came the way Denise Okafor did everything, quietly, precisely, through the proper channels and the proper order, with the kind of documentation that does not leave room for a counter-narrative. The Ohio Division of Securities filed formal charges against Hargrove Capital Partners on a Tuesday morning in early December, 41 days after Denise Okafor submitted her initial report. The charges were specific: securities fraud, investor misrepresentation, and breach of fiduciary duty across 43 transactions spanning 6 years in 3 Ohio counties. The dollar figure attached to the complaint was $42,700,000. It was not an estimate. It was a calculation, supported by transaction records, internal memoranda, and the subsidiary documents that Sandra Leith had carried in a manila folder to a small room on the 12th floor of a glass tower on a Wednesday evening. Clifton Hargrove's photograph was in the Columbus Dispatch by Wednesday. Not the one from his office wall, not the handshake with the senator, not the evidence of access and arrival. A different photograph, the kind taken outside a courthouse in the flat gray light of a winter morning, by a photographer who had been waiting. He did not look like a man who owned the room. He looked like a man who had finally understood that the room had never been his. 3 of his senior partners entered plea agreements within 60 days of the initial filing. The firm's assets were frozen pending the outcome of the federal review. The Ashford Club quietly removed his membership from its active roster, not with a letter, not with a phone call, but with the particular silence of an institution that has decided a person no longer exists in the way they once did. His attorney issued 2 more statements. Neither of them said anything the documents had not already said more clearly. Sandra Leith received her whistleblower designation from the SEC on the same day the formal charges were filed. She had cooperated fully. She had answered every question, produced every document she had retained, and sat for 3 separate interviews with federal investigators without once softening what she knew. She lost the job at Hargrove Capital, which she had already known she would lose. She found another position within 6 weeks, a senior compliance role at a regional investment firm whose managing partner had heard through the channels such things travel that Sandra Leith was the kind of person who, when it mattered, told the truth. Her salary was higher than it had been. Her sleep, she would later say, was better. Denise Okafor returned to her office the afternoon the charges were filed. She set her leather portfolio on her desk, looked at the framed card in her mother's handwriting for a moment that lasted no longer than a breath, and then opened her calendar. She had 3 new client engagements scheduled for the following week. She moved to the first one. She did not celebrate. She did not hold a press conference. She did not issue a statement. The work had spoken for itself, in the plain language of numbers, in the way her mother had always said it would. Now, here is where the story of Marcus and Renee Caldwell, and of Denise Okafor, and of Sandra Leith, and of Priya Suresh, and of every person who had been quietly building something in the silence where other people made assumptions. Here is where it returns to its beginning. On a Saturday morning in late December, Marcus Caldwell drove to Fenwick Street in East Columbus. He parked in front of the 2-bedroom house where he had grown up, the same house where the sidewalk still cracked in summer and the furnace still coughed through January. His father, Raymond, was on the porch with a cup of coffee, wearing the same canvas jacket he had worn for 15 winters. His mother, Gloria, was inside, and the smell of her kitchen, coffee and something baking, something warm, came through the screen door and into the cold morning air. Marcus sat down on the porch steps. Raymond did not ask him how the week had gone. He did not ask about the partnership with Gerald Whitfield, which had been formally announced 10 days earlier in a joint press release that named Marcus A. Caldwell as a principal partner in the expanded commercial division of what would now be called Whitfield Caldwell Realty Partners. He did not ask about the Westfield Heights Corridor Holdings, or the 14 properties, or the name that had appeared in the Columbus Dispatch's business section for the first time in Marcus's career. Raymond Caldwell looked at his son for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandmother would have something to say about all this." Marcus smiled, just slightly. "She would have said she already knew." Raymond nodded once. He looked out at the street. The coffee steamed in his hand. Neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind. The kind that is built from decades of understanding that some things do not need to be spoken to be true. Priya Suresh received her promotion to senior associate at Whitfield Caldwell Realty Partners the week the new partnership was formalized. Gerald Whitfield delivered the news himself, in his office, with the directness of a man who had decided to stop waiting to do things he should have done. She had a new commission structure, a new title, and Gerald's personal assurance that the showing data pattern she had observed over 14 months would be reviewed systematically, that a new intake and assignment protocol would be developed to address what the data showed. It was not a small thing. It was the kind of change that does not make headlines but reshapes, quietly and over time, the experience of the next person who walks through a door and stands in a foyer and waits to be seen for who they are. Dana Mercer applied for her real estate license in a neighboring county 8 weeks after her termination. The application was reviewed. The circumstances of her departure from Whitfield Realty were part of the record. The application was denied. She did not appear again in this story. She had made her choices in a garage on Clearwater Drive, and the choices had made her. Now here is what I want you to hold on to when this story is over. Marcus Caldwell was not an exception. He was not a miracle. He was a man who had done the work quietly for decades and who had been seen as something lesser by someone who never bothered to look. Denise Okafor was not an exception. She was a woman who had listened to numbers the way her mother taught her, who had walked into a room where she was not expected to matter, and who had let the truth speak in the only language that could not be dismissed. Sandra Leith was not an exception. She was a person who had carried something too long and finally set it down, at cost to herself, because it was the right thing to do. These things happen every day. Not always in glass towers or colonial houses on Clearwater Drive. Sometimes in a hallway in a conference room, in a waiting area where someone is told to wait longer than they should. Someone looks at a person and makes a judgment in the space between one breath and the next, and that judgment is wrong, and the person on the receiving end of it knows it is wrong, and they hold themselves still, hands visible, chin level, shoulders easy, and they do not flinch, and they do not retaliate, and they carry what they have built in silence, and they let the work speak when they are gone from the room. Estelle Caldwell said it to a 14-year-old boy in a kitchen in East Columbus, pressing her hands flat against the table to steady herself against the weight of everything she had survived. Stay low, build high, let the work speak when you are gone from the room. She was 81 years old, and she had already understood what some people spend their whole lives refusing to learn. The question is not whether you have ever been the person in that foyer. The question is whether you have ever been the person who looked at someone and made a decision before you knew who you were standing in front of. And if you have, most of us have in one way or another, the question is what you do with that. That is the question worth sitting with. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment and tell me. Have you ever been underestimated the way Marcus was? Or have you ever been the one who looked at someone and got it completely wrong? I want to hear it. And if you believe the people the world overlooks deserve to have their stories told with the care they were never given in the room, subscribe to this channel. Every week we find those people. Every week we tell their stories, because the work deserves to speak, and so do the people who did it.